A note about witches. In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red-hot sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red-hot than hatred you could possibly imagine. A real witch spends all her time plotting to get rid of the children in her particular territory. Her passion is to do away with them one by one. It is all the things about the whole day long. Even if she is working as a cashier in a supermarket, or typing letters for a businessman, or driving around in a fancy car, and she could be doing any of these things. Her mind will always be plotting and screaming and charging and burning and whizzing and fizzing with murderous, bloodthirsty thoughts. Which child, she says to herself all day long, exactly which child shall I choose for my next squelching? A real witch gets the same pleasure from squelching a child as you get from eating a plateful of strawberries and thick cream. They reckons on doing away with one child a week. Anything less, that she becomes grumpy. One child a week is 52 a year. Squish them and squeegee them and make them disappear. It is the motto of the witches. Very carefully, a victim is chosen. Then the witch stalks the wretched child like a hunter stalking a little bird in the forest. She treads softly, she moves quietly, she gets closer and closer. Then at last, when everything is ready, fizz, and she whoops, sparks fly, flames leap, oil boils, rats howl, skin shivers, and the child disappears. A witch, you must understand, does not knock children on the head or stick knives into them or shot at them with a pistol. People who do those things get caught by the police. A witch never gets caught. Don't forget that she has magic in her fingers and devilry dancing in her blood. She can make stones jump about like frogs, and she can make tongues of flame go flickering across the surface of the water. These magic powers are very frightening. Luckily, there are not a great number of real witches in the world today, but there are still quite enough to make you nervous. In England, there are probably about 100 of them altogether. Some countries have more, others have not quite so many. No country in the world is completely free from witches. A witch is always a woman. I do not wish to speak badly about women, Most women are lovely, but the fact remains that all witches are women. There is no such thing as a male witch. On the other hand, a girl is always a male. So indeed is a bark nest. Both are dangerous, but neither of them is half as dangerous as a real witch. As far as the children are concerned, a real witch is easily the most dangerous of all the living creatures on earth. What makes her doubly dangerous is the fact that she doesn't look dangerous. Even when you know all the secrets, and you will hear about those in a minute, you can still never be quite sure whether it is a witch you are gazing at or just a kind lady. If a tiger were able to make himself look like a large dog with a veggie tail, you would probably cut up and pat him on the head. It would be the end of you. It is the same with witches. They all look like nice ladies. Kindly examine the picture below. Which lady is the witch? That is a difficult question, but it is one that every child must try to answer. For all you know, a witch might be living next door to you right now, or she might be a woman with the bright eyes who sat opposite you on the bus this morning. She might be the lady with a dazzling smile who offered you a sweet from a white paper bag in the street before lunch. She might even, and this will make you jump, she might even be a lovely school teacher who is reading these words to you at this moment. Look carefully at the teacher. Perhaps she is smiling at the absurdity of such suggestion. Don't let that put you off. It could be part of her cleverness. I am not, of course, telling you for 1 second that your teacher actually is a witch. I am all saying that she might be one. It is almost unlikely, but in here comes the big but. It is not impossible. Oh, if only there were a way of telling for sure whether a woman was a witch or not. Then we could round them all up and put them in the meat grinder. Unhappily, there is no such way, but there are a number of little signals you can look out for, little quickly habits that all witches have in common. And if you know about this, if you remember them always, then you might just possibly manage to escape from being squelched before you are much older. My grandmother. I myself had 2 separate encounters with witches before I always was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion, I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and I had lived there and had started going to an English school. Twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, just was about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which, we were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than to my mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down in a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly stepped into the back seat and received only a cut of the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of the terrible afternoon. I still have the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house with her arms around me, tight, and both of us crying the whole night long. What are we going to do now? I asked her, thought the tears. You will stay here with me, she said, and I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? No, she said, I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. The next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me the stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got on to the subject of the witches. She was apparently a great expert of these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the absolute true. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. What was worse, that was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandma? Really and truly truthful? My darling, she said, you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandma. So can I spot them? You must listen to me. My grandmother said, You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room of her house in the Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive white body which smothered in great lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair, feeling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, was wearing pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers. You swear you aren't pulling my leg? I kept saying to her. You swear you aren't just pretending? Listen, she said, I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them. I still think you are just trying to frighten me, I said. I'm trying to make sure you don't go to the same way, she said. I love you and I want you to stay with me. Tell me about the children who disappeared, I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I've ever met who smoked cigars. She lit on now a long black cigar that smelled of burning rubber. The first child I knew who disappeared, she said. She was called Ranghild Hansen. Ranghild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath on air. Where is Ranghild? She asked. She went away with a tall lady, the little sister, I said. What tall lady? The mother said. The tall lady in white gloves, the little sister said. She took Ranghild by the hand and led her away. No one, the grandmother said, ever saw Ranghild again. Didn't they search for her? I asked. They searched for miles around. Every in the town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other 4 children? I asked. They vanished, just as Ranghild did. How, Grandma? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. The second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. There was a family called Christiansen. They lived up on Holmenål and they had an old oil painting in their living room which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard and the farmhouse in the background. It was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter, Solveig, came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. The next morning, little Solveig was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden, her father shouted, "There she is!" That's Solveig feeding the ducks. He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Solveig wasn't it. She was standing in the farmyard, in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of a basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her. But that didn't help. She was simply a part of the painting, just a picture painted on a canvas. Did you ever see the painting, Grandma, with a little girl in it? Many times, my grandma said, and the peculiar thing was that little Solveig kept changing her position in the picture. One day she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day she would be far over to the left with the ducks in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandma? Nobody did. Wherever she was, whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out of the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, my grandmother said, very odd indeed. And what was the most odd of all was that as these years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then at once, 54 years after it all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows? My grandmother said. Some very mysterious thing got on in the world of witches. That's two you told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was little Bridget Swanson, my grandmother said. She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, she had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept for years in a pan in the garden. She even laid eggs. What color eggs? I said. Brown ones. My grandmother said, biggest eggs I ever seen in my life. Her mother made omelets out of them. Delicious they were. I gazed up at my grandmother, who sat there like some ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty grey, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. The cigar was the only real thing about her at the moment, and she smoked. It made billows round her head in blue clouds. But the little girl who became a chicken didn't disappear? No, not Bridget. She lived on for many years laying her brown eggs. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I'm getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the first child? I asked. The first was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. One morning, his skin went all greyish-yellow. Then it became hard and cracky, like the shell of a nut. By evening, the boy had turned to stone. Stone, I said. You mean real stone? Granite, she said. I'll take you to see him if you like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. Although I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, and with never a smile on her face or a twinkle in her eye, that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandma, I said. You told me there were 5 altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like a puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmama. I don't care what you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. What about number 5, Grandmama? Number 5, she said, chewing the end of her cigars as though it were delicious asparagus, was rather an interesting case. A 9-year-old boy called Leif was summer holidaying with his family on the front, and the whole family was picnicking and swimming off some rocks off on those little islands. Young Leif dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under for an unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leif anymore. What was he, Grandmama? He was a porpoise. He wasn't. He couldn't have been. He was a lovely young porpoise, she said, and as friendly as he could be. Grandmama, I said. Yes, my darling. Did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I knew his mother well. She told me all about it. She told me how Leif, the porpoise, stayed with them, and that afternoon Givens, his brothers and sister, rides on his back. They had a wonderful time. Then he weighed a flipper and then swam away, never to be seen again. But Grandmama, I said, how did they know that the porpoise was actually Leif? He talked to them, my grandfather said. He laughed and joked with them all the time. He was giving them rides. But he wasn't there a most tremendous fuss when did this happen? I asked. Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember but there's a Norway where I used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. There's probably one living in our street in every moment. It's time you went to bed. A witch wouldn't come in through my window in the night, would she? I asked, quaking a little. No, grandmother said. A witch will never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along. I'll truck you in. How to recognize a witch. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight, the old woman said, I'm going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one. Can you always be sure? I asked. No, she said, you can't, and that's the trouble. But you can make a pretty good guess. She was dropping cigar ash all over her lap, and I hoped she wasn't going to catch or find before she told me how to recognize a witch. In the first place, she said, a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer, my grandmother said, she has to. Do you want to know why? Why? I said. Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin curvy claws like a cat. And she wears the gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of very respectable women wear gloves, especially in winter, so this doesn't help you very much. Mama used to wear gloves, I said. Not in the house, my grandmother said. Witches wear gloves, even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed. How do you know all this, Grandmama? Don't interrupt, she said. Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that a real witch is always bald. Bald? Bald as boiled eggs, my grandmother said. I was shocked. There was something incident about a bald woman. Why are they bald, Mama? Don't ask me why, she snapped. But you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head. How horrid! Disgusting, my grandmother said. If she's a bald, she's easy to spot, she said. Not at all, my grandmother said. A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a first-class wig, and it is the most impossible to tell a real first-class wig from ordinary hair unless you give it a pull to see if it comes off. Then that's what I'll have to do, I said. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try to see what happens. So that doesn't help me much either, I said. None of these things in any good on its own, my grandmother said. It's only when you put them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you, my grandmother went on, these wings to cause a rather serious problem for witches. What problem, Grandmama? They make the scalp itch most terribly, she said. You see, when an actress wears a wig, or if you or I were to wear a wig, we would be putting it over our own hair. But a witch has to put it straight onto her naked scalp. And underneath, a big wig is always very rough and scratchy. It sets up a frightful itch on the bald skin. It causes nasty sores on the head. We crush the witch's callot, and it doesn't help itch. What other things must I look for to recognize a witch? I asked. Look for the nose holes, my grandmother said. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like the rim of a certain kind of seashell. Why do they have such big nose holes? I asked. For smelling with, my grandmother said. A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street. On a pitch-black night, she couldn't smell me. I've just had a bath. Oh yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaner you happen to be, the more smelly you're to a witch. That can't be true, I said. An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. The dirtier you are, the less you smell. But doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh yes, it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling. It's you. The smell that drives a witch mad actually comes right out of your own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in waves, and these waves, stink waves the witches call them, go floating through the air and hit the witch right smack in her nostrils. They send her reading. Now wait a minute, Grandmama. Don't interrupt, she said. The point is, when you haven't washed for a week and your skin is all covered over with dirt, then quite obviously the stink waves cannot come oozing out nearly so strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. Just don't have one too often, my grandmother said. Once a month, it's quite enough for a sensible child. It was at moments like these that I loved my grandmother more than ever. Grandmama, I said, if it's a dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up? Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves, she said. Only children do that. But don't really cue our stink waves, do I? I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I? No, not to me you aren't, my grandmother said. To me you're smelling like raspberries and cream, but to a witch you would be smelling absolutely disgusting. What would I be sleeping off? I asked. Dog's droppings, my grandmother said. I reeled. I was stunned. Dog's droppings, I cried. I'm not smelling of dog's droppings. I don't believe I won't be it. That was more, my grandmother said, speaking with a touch of relish. To a witch you'd be smelling of fresh dog's droppings. That is simply not true, I cried. And now I'm not smelling of dog's droppings, stale fresh. There is no point in arguing about, my grandmother said. It's a fact of life. I was outraged. I simply couldn't bring myself to believe what my grandmother was telling me. So if you see a woman holding her nose as she passes you in the street, she went on, that woman could be easily a witch. I decided to change the object. Tell me what else to look for in a witch, I said. The eyes, my grandmother said. Look carefully at the eyes, because the eyes of a real witch are different from yours and mine. Look in the middle of each eye, where there is a normally little black dot. If she's a witch, the black dot will keep changing color, and if you will see fire and you will see eyes dancing right in the very center of the color dark. It will send shivers running all over your skin. My grandmother leaned back in her chair and sucked away contentedly at a full black cigar. I squatted on the floor, staring up at her, fascinated. She was not smiling. She looked deadly serious. All the other things? I asked her. Of course there are other things, my grandma said. You don't seem to understand that witches are not actually a woman at all. They look like a woman, they talk like a woman, and they are able to act like a woman. But actually, in fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human shape. That is why they have claws and bald heads and queer noses and peculiar eyes, all of which they have to conceal as best they can from the rest of the world. What else is different about them, Grandmama? The feet, she said. Witches never had toes. No toes, I cried. Then what do they have? They have just feet, my grandmother said. The feet have square ends with no toes of them at all. Does that make it difficult to walk? I asked. Not at all, my grandmother said. But it does give them a problem with their shoes. All ladies like to wear small, rather pointed shoes, but a witch whose feet are very wide and square at the ends has the most awful job squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes. Why doesn't she wear white, comfy shoes with square ends? I asked. She dare not, my grandmother said. Just as she hides her baldness with a wig, she must also hide her ugly witch's feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes. Isn't that terribly uncomfortable? I said. extremely uncomfortable, my grandmother said. But she was to put up with it. If she's wearing ordinary shoes, I won't help me to recognize her. Will I, Grandmama? I'm afraid you won't, my grandmother said. You might possibly see her limping very slightly, but only if you are watching closely. Are those the only differences then, Grandmama? There is one more, my grandmother said. Just one more. What is that, Grandmama? Their spit is blue. Blue, I cried. Not blue, their spit can't be blue. Blue is a blueberry, she said. You don't mean it, Grandmama. Nobody can have a blue spit. Witches can, she said. Is it like ink? I asked. Exactly, she said. They even use it to write with. They use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs, and they simply lick the nib. Can you notice the blue spit, Grandma? If a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you looked carefully, my grandmother said. If you looked very carefully, you would probably see a slight bluish tinge on her teeth. But it doesn't show much. It would be if she spat, I said. Witches never spit, my grandmother said. They daren't. I could believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week, and she said grace before every meal, and somebody who did it would tell lies. I was beginning to believe every word she spoke. So there you are, my grandmother said. That's all about, I can tell you. No one of it is very helpful. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman is a witch or not just by looking at her. But if she might be a witch, if she has a bluish tinge on her teeth, if she has all these things, then you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were a little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, my grandmother said, only once. What happened? I'm not going to tell you, she said. It would be frightening you out of your skin and give you bad dreams. Please tell me, I begged. No, she said, certain things are too horrible to talk about. Does it have something to do with your missing thumb? I asked. Suddenly, her old twinkle lips shut tight as a pair of tongues, and she handed her the cigar, which had no thumb on it, began to quiver very slightly. I waited. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. All of a sudden, she had shut herself off completely. The conversation was finished. Good night, Grandmama, I said, rising from the floor and kissing her on the cheek. She didn't move. I crept out of the room and went to my bedroom. The Grand High Witch. The next day, a man in a black suit arrived at the house carrying a briefcase, and he held a long conversation with my grandmother in the living room. I was not allowed a while he was there, but when at last he went away, my grandmother came in to me, walking very slowly and looking very sad. The man was reading me your father's will, she said. What is a will? I asked her. If something you write before you die, she said. And eating, you say, who is going to have your money and your property. But most important of all, it says who is going to look after your child if both the mother and father are dead. A fearful panic took hold of me. Did it say you, Grandmama? I cried. I don't have to go somebody else, do I? No, she said. Your father would never have done that. He asked me to take care of you for as long as I live, but he has also asked that I take you back to your own house in England. He wants to stay there. But why, I said, why can't we stay here in Norway? You wouldn't hate to live anywhere else. You told me you would. I know, she said, but there are a lot of complications with money and with the house that you wouldn't understand. Also, it said the will that although all your family Norwegian, you were born in England and you have to start your education there, and he wants you to continue going to England schools. Oh, Grandmama, I cried, you don't want to go and live in your English house. I know you don't. Of course I don't, she said, but I'm afraid I must. The will said that your mother felt the same way about it, and it's important to respect the wishes of the parents. There was no way out of it. We had to go to England, and my grandmother started making arrangements at once. Your next school term begins in a few days, she said, so we don't have any time to waste. One evening before we left for England, my grandmother got on to her favorite subject once again. There are not as many witches in England as there are in Norway, she said. I'm sure I won't meet one, I said. I sincerely hope you won't, she said, because those English witches are probably the most witches in the whole world. As she sat there smoking her foul cigar and walking away, I kept looking at the land with a missing thumb. I couldn't help it. I was fascinated by it, and I kept wondering what awful thing had happened the time when she had met a witch. I must have been something absolutely appalling and gruesome, otherwise she would have told me about it. Maybe the thumb had been twisted off. Or perhaps she had been forced to jam her thumb down the spout of a boiling kettle until it was steamed away. Or did someone pull it out of her hand like a tooth? I couldn't help trying to guess. Tell me that those English wishes do, Grandma, I said. Well, she said, sucking away at her stinking cigar. Their favorite ruse is to mix up a powder that will turn a child into some creature or other that all grown-ups hate. What sort of creature, Grandmama? Often it's a slug, she said. A slug is one of their favorites. Then the grown-ups step on the slug and squish it without knowing it's a child. That's perfectly beastly, I cried. Or it might be a flea. My grandmother said they might turn you a flea, and without releasing that what is going, your own mother would get out of the flea powder, and then it's goodbye for you. You're making me nervous, Grandmama. I don't think I won't go back to the England. I've no English witches, she went on, who have turned children into pheasants and then sneaked the pheasants up to the woods the very day before pleasant shooting season opened. Ouch, I said. So they'd get shot? Of course they get shot. And then they plucked and roasted and eaten for supper. I pictured myself as a pleasant frying frantically over the men with the guns, swerving and tapping the guns exploded below me. Yes, my grandmother said, it gives the English witches great pleasure to stand back and watch the grown-ups doing away with their own children. I really don't want to go to England, Grandmama. Of course you don't, she said. Nor do I, but I'm afraid we've got to. Are the witches different in every country? I asked. Completely different, my grandmother said. But I don't know how much about other countries. Don't you even know about America? I asked. Not really, she answered. Although I have heard it said the witches are able to make the grown-ups eat their own children's. Never, I cried. Oh no, Grandma, that couldn't be true. I don't know whether is it true or not, she said. It's only a rumor I've heard. But how could they possibly make them eat their own children? I asked. By turning them in hot dogs, she said. That wouldn't be too difficult for a clever witch. Does every single country in the world have its witches? I have. Whenever you find people, you find witches, my grandmother said. There is a secret society of witches in every country. And do they all know one another, Grandmama? They do not, she said. A witch only knows the witches in your own country. She is strictly forbidden to communicate with any foreign witches. But an English witch, for example, will know all the others witches in England. They are all friends. They ring each other up. swap deadly recipes. Goodness knows what else that they talk about. I hate to think. I sat on the floor, watching my grandmother. She put her cigar stub in the ashtray and folded her hands across her stomach. Once a year, she went on, the witches of each separate country hold their own secret meeting, and all get together in one place to receive a lecture from the Grand High Witch of all the world. From who? I cried. This is the rule of them all, my grandmother said. She is all-powerful, she is without mercy. All other witches are petrified of her. They see her only once a year with their annual meeting. She goes through a weep and excitement and enthusiasm and go to give others. The Grand High Witch traveled from country to country attending these annual meetings. Where do they have these meetings, Grandma? There are all sorts of rumors. I have heard it said that they just book into a hotel like any other group of women who are holding a meeting. I have also heard it said that some very peculiar things go on in the hotels they stay in. It is rumored that the beds are never slept in. There are burn marks on the bedroom carpets. Dead turds are discovered in the bathtubs. And what down in the kitchen, the cook once found a baby crocodile swimming in his saucepan of soup. My grandmother picked up her cigar and took another puff, inhaling the full smoke deeply into her lungs. Where does the Grand High Witch live when he is at home? I asked. Nobody knows. Nobody knows, my grandmother said. If we knew that, then she could be rooted out and destroyed. Witch Philippines all over the world have spent their lives trying to discover the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. What is a witch folk, Grandmama? A person who studies witches and knows a lot about them, my grandmother said. Are you a witchophile, Grandmama? I'm retired witchophile, she said. I'm too old to be active any longer. But when I was younger, I traveled all over the globe trying to track down the Grand High Witch. I never came ever close to the succeeding. Is she rich? I asked. She's rolling, my grandmother said, simply rolling in money. Rumor has it that there is a machine in her headquarters which is exactly like the machine the government uses to print the banknotes you and I use. After all, banknotes are only pieces of paper with special designs and pictures of them. Anyone can make them who has the right machine and the right paper. My guess is that the Grand High Witch makes all the money she wants, and she dishes it out of witches everywhere. What about foreign money? I asked. Those machines can make Chinese money if you want them to, my grandmother said. It's only a question of pressing the right button. But Grandmama, I said, if nobody has ever seen the Grand High Witch, how can you be so sure she exists? My grandmother gave me a long and very severe look. Nobody has ever seen the devil, she said, but we know he exists. The next morning, we sailed for England as soon as I was back in the old family house in Kent, but this time with only my grandfather to look at me. Then the Easter term began, and every weekday I went to school, and everything seemed to have come back to normal again. Now at the bottom of our garden there was an enormous conkin tree, and high up in its branches Timmy, my best friend, and I had started to build a magnificent tree house. We were able to work on it only at the weekends, but we were getting along fine. We had begun with the floor, which we built by laying white planks between two quiet fire-apart branches and nailing them down. Within a month, we had finished the floor. Then we constructed a wooden railing around the floor, and that left only the roof to be built. The roof was the difficult bit. On Saturday afternoon, when Timmy was in bed with flu, I decided to make a start on the roof all by myself. I was lovely being high up there in that concord tree, all alone with the pale young leaves coming out everywhere around me. It was like being in a big green cave. And the high made it extra exciting. My grandmother had told me that if I fell, I would break a leg, and every time I looked down, I got a tingle along my spine. It worked away, nailing the first plank on the roof. Then suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a woman standing immediately below me. She was looking up at me and smiling in the most peculiar way. When most people smile, their lips go out sideways. This woman's lip went upward and downward, showing all her front teeth and gums. The gums were like raw meat. It is always a shock to discover what you are being watched when you think you are alone. And what was the strange woman doing in our garden anyway? I noticed that she was wearing a small black hat, and she had black gloves on her hand, and the gloves came nearly up to her elbow. Gloves! She was wearing gloves! I froze all over. "I have a present for you," she said, still staring at me, still smiling, still showing her teeth and gums. I did not answer. "Come down out of that tree, little boy," she said, "and I shall give you the most exciting present you've ever had." Her voice had a curious rasping quality. It made a sort of metallic sound, as though her throat was full of drawing pins, without taking her eyes from my face. She was very slowly put one of those gloves' hands into a purse and drew out a small green snake. She held up for me to see. "It's tame," she said. The snake began to coil itself around her forearm. It was brilliant green. "If you come down here, she'll give him to you," she said. "Oh, Grandmama, I thought come and help me." Then I panicked. I dropped the hammer and shot up the enormous tree like a monkey. I didn't stop until I was as high as I could possibly go, and there I stayed, quivering with fear. I couldn't see a woman now. There were layers and layers of leaves between her and me. I stayed up here for hours and I kept very still. It began to grow dark. At last I heard Grandmother calling my name. "I'm up here," I shouted back. "Come down at once," she called out. "It's past your supper time." "Grandmama," I shouted, "has that woman gone?" "What woman?" my grandmother called back. "The woman in the black gloves." There was silence from below. It was the silence of somebody who was too stunned to speak. "Grandmama," I shouted again, "has she gone?" "Yes," my grandmother answered at last. "She's gone. I'm here, my darling. I'll look after you. You can come down." I climbed down. I was trembling. My grandmother enfolded me in her arms. "I've seen a witch," I said. "Come inside," she said. "You'll be all right with me." She led me into the house and gave me a cup of hot cocoa with lots of sugar in it. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. By the time I had finished, it was my grandmother who was trembling. Her face was ashy grey, and I saw her glance down at that head of hers that didn't have a thumb. "You know what it means," she said. "It means that there is one of them in our district. From now on, I'm not letting you walk alone to school. Do you think she could be after me especially?" "No," she said. "I doubt that. One child is as good as any other to those creatures. It is hardly surprising that after that I became a very witch-conscious little boy. If I happened to be alone on the road and saw a woman approaching who was wearing gloves, I would quickly skip across to the other side. And as the weather remained pretty cold during the whole of that month, nearly everybody was wearing gloves. Curiously enough, though, I never saw the woman with the green snake again. That was my first witch, but it wasn't my last. Summer holidays. The Easter holidays came and went, and the summer term began at school. My grandmother and I had already planned to take our summer holiday in Norway, and we talked about almost nothing else every evening. She had booked a cabin for each of us on the boat from Newcastle to Oslo, and the earliest possible moment after my school broke up, and from Oslo she was going to take me a place she knew down on the south coast near Ranghild, where she had spent her own summer holidays as a child nearly 80 years ago. All day long, she said, my brother and I were out in a rowing boat. The whole coast is dotted with tiny islands, and there's nobody of them. We used to explore them and dive into the sea of the lovely smooth granite rocks, and sometimes on the way out we would drop the anchor and fish food core, and whittling, if we were caught anything, we would build a fire on an island and fry the fish in a pan for our lunch. There is no finer fish in the world than absolutely fresh cod. What did you use for bait, Grandmama, when you went fishing? Mussels, she said. Everyone uses mussel for bait in Norway, and if we didn't catch any fish, we would boil the mussels in a saucepan and eat those. Were they all good? Delicious, she said. Cook them in the sea water and they're tender and salty. What else did you do, Grandmama? We used to row out and wave to the shrimp boats on their way home, and they would stop and give us a handful of shrimps each. The shrimps were still warm from having been just cooked, and we would sit in their rolling boat peeling them and gobbling them up. The head was the best part. The head? I said. You squeeze the head between your teeth, suck out the inside. It's marvelous. You and I will do all those things this summer, my darling, she said. Grandmama, I said, I can't wait. I simply can't wait to go. Nor can I, she said. When there were only 3 weeks of the summer term left, an awful thing happened. My grandmother got pneumonia. She became very ill, and trained nurse moved into the house to look after her. The doctor explained to me that pneumonia is not normally a dangerous illness nowadays because of this penicillin, but when a person is more than 80 years old, as my grandmother was, then it is very dangerous indeed. He said he didn't even dare to move her to hospital in her condition. So she stayed in her bedroom, and I hung about outside the door while oxygen cylinders and all sort of other frightening things were taken into her. Can I go and see her? I asked. No, dear, the nurse said. Not at the moment. A fat and jolly lady called Mrs. Spring, who used to come and clear our house every day, also moved and slept in the house. Mr. Spring looked after me and cooked my meals. I liked her very much, but she wasn't a pet of my grandmother for telling stories. One evening, about 10 days later, the doctor came downstairs and said to me, You can go on and see her now, but only for a short time. She's been asking for you." I flew up the stairs, but burst into my grandmother's room and threw myself into her arms. "Here, there," the nurse said. "Be careful with her." "Will you be all right now, Grandmama?" I asked. "The worst is over," she said. "I'll soon be up again." "Will she?" I said to the nurse. "Oh, yes," the nurse answered, smiling. "She told us she simply had to get better because she had to look after you." I gave her another hug. "They won't let me have a cigar," she said, "but you wait till they're gone." The nurse was right. Within a week, my grandmother was stomping around the house with her gold-topped cane and interfering with Mrs. Spring's cooking. "I thank you for all your help, Mrs. Spring," she said, "but you can't go home now." "Oh, no, I can't," Mrs. Spring said. "Doctor told me to see that you take it very easy for the next few days." The doctor said more than that. He dropped a bombshell on my grandmother and me by telling us that no account were we to risk the journey to Norway this summer. "Rubbish!" my grandmother cried. "I've promised him we'll go." "It's too far," the doctor said. "It would be very dangerous. But I'll tell you what you can do. You can take your grandson to a nice hotel on the south coast of England instead. The sea air is just what you need." "Oh no," I said. "Do you want your grandmother to die?" the doctor asked me. "Never," I said. "Then don't let her go on long journey this summer. She's not very strong enough. And stop her smoking those wild black cigars." In the end, the doctor had his way about the holiday, but not about the cigars. Rooms were booked for us in a place called the Hotel Magnificent in the famous seaside town of Bournemouth. Bournemouth, my grandmother told me, was full of old people like herself. They retired there by thousands because the air was so bracing and healthy it kept them, so they believed a life will a few extra years. "Does it?" I asked. "Of course not," she said. "It's stammered. But just for once I think we've got to obey the doctor." So after that, my grandmother and I took the train to Bournemouth and settled into Hotel Magnificent. It was an enormous white building on the seafront, and it looked to me like a pretty boring place to spend a summer holiday in. I had my own separate bedroom, but there was a door connecting to my room with my grandmother's room, so that we could visit each other without going into the corridor. Just before we left for Bournemouth, my grandmother had given me, as consolation, a present of 2 white mice in a little cage. And of course, I took them with me. They were terrific fun, those mice. I called them William and Mary. And in the hotel, I set out right away, teaching them to do tricks. The first trick I taught them was to creep up the sleeve of my jacket and come out by my neck. Then I taught them to climb the back of my neck onto the top of my head. I did this by putting cake crumbs in my hair. On the very first morning after our arrival, the chambermaid was making my bed when one of my knives poked its head out from under the sheets. The maid let out a shriek that brought a dozen people running to see who was being murdered. I was reported to the manager. They followed an unpleasant scene in the manager's office with the manager, my grandmother, and me. The manager, whose name was Mr. Stranger, was a bristly man in a black tailcoat. "I cannot permit mice in my hotel, madam," he said to me and to my grandmother. "How dare you say that when your rotten hotel is full of rats anyway?" my grandmother said. "Rats!" cried Mr. Stranger, going mauve in the face. "There are no rats in this hotel." "I saw one this morning," my grandmother said. "It was running down the corridor into the kitchen." "That's not true," cried Mr. Stranger. "You had better get the rat catcher in at once," my grandmother said, "before I report you to the public health authorities. I expect there are rats scuttling all over the kitchen floor and stealing the food off the shelves and jumping in and out of the soup." "Never!" cried Mr. Stranger. "No wonder my breakfast toast was all nibbled round the edges this morning." My grandmother went on relentlessly. "No wonder it had a nasty, ratty taste. You are not careful, the health people will be ordering the entire hotel to be closed before everyone gets typhoid fever." "You are not being serious, madam," Mr. Stranger said. "I was never more serious in my life," my grandmother said. "Are you or are you going to allow my grandson to keep his white mice in his room?" The manager knew when he was beaten. "May I suggest a compromise, madam?" he said. "I will permit him to keep them in his room as long as they are never allowed out of cage. How's that?" "That will suit us very well," my grandmother said, and she stood up and marched out of the room with me behind her. There is no way you can train mice inside a cage. Yet I dared not throw that out because the chambermaid was spying on me all the time. She had a key to my door, and she kept bursting in all hours trying to catch me with a mice out of the cage. She told me that the first mouse to break the rules would be downed in a bucket of water by the hall porter. I decided to seek a safer place where I could carry on with the training. There must be surely been an empty room in this enormous hotel. I put one mouse into each trousers pocket and wandered downstairs in search of a secret spot. The ground floor of the hotel was a maze of public rooms, and all of them named in gold letters on the doors. I wandered through the lounge and the smoking room and the card room and the reading room and the drawing room. None of them was empty. I went down a long wide corridor, and in the end of it I came to the ballroom. There were double doors leading into it, and in front of the doors there was a large notice board on the stand. The notice on the board said, RPCC meeting. Strictly private, this room is reserved for the annual meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The double doors into the room were open. I peeped in. It was a colossal room. There were rows and rows of chairs, all facing a platform. The chairs were painted in gold, and they had a little red cushions on the seats. But there was not a soul inside. I sidled cautiously into the room. What a lovely secret silent place it was. The meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children must have taken place earlier in the day, and now they had all gone home. Even if they hadn't, even if they did suddenly come pouring in, they would be wonderful, kind people who would look with favor upon a young mouse trainer going about his business. At the back of the room, there was a large folding screen with Chinese dragons painted on it. I decided, just to be on the safe side, to go behind the screen and to do training there. I wasn't a bit frightened of the prevention of cruelty to children people, but there was always a chance that Mr. Stranger, the manager, might pop his head round the door. If he did, and he saw the miss, he poor things would be in the hall porter's bucket of water before I could shut up. I tiptoed to the back of the room and settled myself on the thick green carpet behind the big screen. What a splendid place it was, ideal for mouse training. I took William and Mary out of my trousers pocket. They sat beside me on the carpet, quiet and well behaved. The trick I was going to teach them today was tightrope walking. It is not all that difficult to train an intelligent mouse to be an expert tightrope walker, provided you know exactly how to go about it. First, you must have a piece of string. I had that. Then you must have some good cake. A fine currant cake is the favorite food of white mice. They're doty about it. I had brought with me a rock cake, which I had poked while having tea with Grandmama the day before. Now here's what you do. You stretch the string tight between your two hands, but you start by keeping it very short, only about 3 inches. You put the mouse on your right hand and the little piece of cake on your left hand. The mouse is therefore only 3 inches away from the cake. He can see it and he can smell it. His whiskers twitch with excitement. He can almost reach the cake by leaning forward, but not quite. He only has to take 2 steps along the string to reach this tasty morsel. He ventures forward, one paw on the string, then the other. If the mouse has a good sense of balance, and most of them have, the will get across easily. I started with William. He walked the string without a moment's hesitation. I let him have a quick nibble of the cake, just to whet his appetite. Then I put him back on my right hand. This time I lengthened the string. I made it about 6 inches long. William knew what to do now. With super balance, he walked step by step along the string until he reached the cake. He was rewarded with another nibble. Quite soon, William was walking a 24-inch tight rope, or rather tight string, from one hand to the other to reach the cake. It was wonderful to watch him. He was enjoying himself tremendously. I was careful to hold the string near the carpet so that if he did lose his balance, he wouldn't have far to fall. But he never fell. William was obviously a natural acrobat, a great tightrope walking mouse. Now it's Mary's turn. I put William on the carpet beside me and rewarded him with some extra crumbs and a currant. Then I started going through the same routine all over again with Mary. My blinding ambition, you see, my dream of dreams, was to become one day the owner of a white mouse circus. I would have a small stage with red curtains in front of it, and then the curtains were drawn apart. The audience would see my world-famous performing miss, walking on tight ropes, swinging from trapezes, turning somersaults in the air, bouncing on trampolines, all the rest of it. I would have white bees riding on white rats, and the rats would gallop curiously round and round the stage. I was beginning to picture myself traveling first class all over the globe with my famous white mouse circus, and performing before all the crowned heads of Europe. I was about halfway through Mary's training when suddenly I heard voices outside the ballroom door. The sound grew louder. It swelled into a great babble of speech from many throats. I recognized the voice of the awful hotel manager, Mr. Stinger. Help, I thought, but he hadn't heard a huge screen. I crouched behind it and peered through the crack between 2 of the wooden censers. I could see the entire length and width of the ballroom without anyone seeing me. "Well, ladies, I'm sure you will be quite comfortable in here," Mr. Stranger's voice was saying. Then in through the double doors he marched, black tailcoat and all, spreading his arms wide as he entered in a great flock of ladies. "If there is anything we can do for you, do not hesitate to let me know," he went on. "Tea will be served for all of you at the Sunshine Terrace after you have concluded your meeting." With that, he bowed and escaped himself out of the room. A vast herd of ladies from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children came steaming in. They were pretty close, and of all of them had hats on their heads. The meeting. Now the manager had gone, I was particularly alarmed. What better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? If I ever got to talk to them, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children preventing at my school. We would certainly use them there. In they came, talking their heads off. They began milling around and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like, "Come and sit next to me, Millie dear. Oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What an adorable dress you have on." I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on with my mouse training, but I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I suggested about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit as far back as the platform as possible. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching the nape of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me away. Her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had dandruff. All of a sudden, I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing, and the next one, and the next. The whole lot of them were doing this. They were all scratching away like a mad at their hair on the backs of their neck. Did they have fleas in their hair? More likely it was nits. A boy at school called Ashton had had nits in his hair last term, and Merton had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. How the skin came away from his scalp. I began to be fascinated by these hair scratching ladies. It was always funny when you catch someone doing something coarse and she thinks no one is looking. No speaking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it had to be nits. Then the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers underneath the hair on her head, and the entire head of hair, lifted upwards all in one piece, and the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around all the rest of the now seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some sort of metal chain round the two door handles. Keep still, I told yourself. No one has seen you yet. There is no reason in the world that they should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze or nose blow, one little sound of any sort of, and it won't be just one witch that gets you. It will be 200. At that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds, and then I came to. I was lying on the carpet, and I was still, thanks heaven, behind the screen. There was absolute silence all around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the crack in the screen. Frizzled like a fritter. All the women, or rather the witches, were now sitting motionless in their chair and staring as though hypnotized at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young, I guessed about 25 or 6, and she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish long black dress that reached right to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up with her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me a witch at all, but she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her clawed fingers unlooking something behind her ears, and then she got hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in the hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table nearby. And when she turned round again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out loud. The face of others was the almost frightful and frightening thing I have ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. It was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something fallen, burdened, and decayed. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away all the edges, and the middle of the face. Around the mouth and cheeks it could see skin, all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were walking away in there. There are times when something is so frightful you become mesmerized by it, can't look away. It was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetized by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also that she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book eating in the hotel, with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming. "The doors!" shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bounced around the walls. "Are they chained and bolted?" "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered a voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were set too deep in that dreadful rattling worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. Her voice, I noticed, that had same hard metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree, only it was far louder and much, much harsher. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, it growled. Everyone in the room was peering off her gloves. It was watching the hand of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Oh yes, I could see several of them now. I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. They were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. "You may remove your shoes," barked the Grand High Witch. I heard a sigh of relief going up from all the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes, and then I got a glimpse under the chair of several pairs of stockings on their feet, square and completely toeless. Revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from the feet with a carving knife. "You may remove your wigs," shouted the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. There was some sort of foreign accent there, something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have in trouble pronouncing with the letter Y. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. She would roll it around her mouth like a piece of hot pork crackling before spitting it out. Remove your wigs and then get some fresh air into your spotty scalps, she shouted, and another sigh of relief arose from the audience, and all the hands went up to the heads, and all the wigs that they had still on them were lifted away. There now appeared in front of me row upon row of bald female heads, a sea or naked scalps, every one of them a red, and each looking from being rubbed by the leanings of the wings. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were, and somehow the whole sight was made more grotesque because underneath those frightful scabby bald heads, the body were dressed in fashionable and rather pretty clothes. It was monstrous. It was unnatural. Oh heavens, I thought. Oh help! Oh Lord, have mercy on me. These 4 bald-headed females are child killers, every one of them, and there I am, imprisoned in the same room, and I can't escape. At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that with their special nose holes they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. It seemed certainly, therefore, that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out at any moment, and then the yell of dogs' droppings would go up all over the room, and I would be concerned like a rat. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe. Then suddenly I remembered another very important thing my grandmother had told me. The dirtier you are, she had said, the harder is it for a witch to smell to you. How long since I had last had a bath? Not for ages. I had my own room in the hotel, and my grandmother never bothered with silly things like that. Come to think of it, I don't believe I'd had a bath since we arrived. When had I last washed my hands and face? Certainly not this morning. Not yesterday either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud and goodness knows what else besides, so perhaps I had a chance after all. The stink waves couldn't possibly get out through all that dirt. Witches of England, shouted the Grand High Witch. She herself, I noticed, had not taken off either her wig or the gloves on her shoes. Witches of England, she yelled. The audience stirred uneasily and sat up straighter in their chairs. Miserable witches, she yelled Useless, lazy witches, feeble, fribling witches, you are a heap of idle, good-for-nothing worms. A shudder went through the audience. The Grand High Witch was clearly in an ugly mood, and they knew it. I had a feeling that something awful was going to happen. "I'm having my breakfast this morning," cried the Grand High Witch, "and I'm looking out of the window of the beach. And what am I seeing? I am asking you, what am I seeing? I'm seeing a revolting sight. I'm seeing hundreds. I'm seeing thousands of rotten, repulsive little children playing on the sand. It's putting me right off my blood." "Why have you not got rid of them?" she screamed. "Why have you not rubbed them all out, those filthy, smelly children?" With each word she spoke, flecks of pale blue phlegm shot from her mouth like little bolts. "I'm asking you," she screamed. Nobody answered the question. "Children smell," she screamed. "They stink out of the world. We don't want these children around here." The bald heads in the audience nodded vigorously. "Von children wig, it is not to me," the Grand High Witch cried out. "Is that the best you can do?" "We will do better," murmured the audience. "We will do much better." "Better, it is no good either," shrieked the Grand High Witch. "I demand maximum results. So here are my orders. My orders are that every single child in this country shall be rubbed out, squashed, squirted, squittered, and frittered before I come here again in 1 year's time. Do I make myself clear?" A great gasp went up from the audience. I saw the witches all looking all another with deeply troubled expression, and I heard one witch in the end of the front row saying aloud, "All of them, we can possibly white all of them." The Grand High Witch wiped her out as though someone had stuck a skewer into the bottom. "Who said that?" she snapped. "Who dares to argue with me? If what's you, what is not?" She pointed a clawed finger, as sharp as a needle, at the witch who had spoken. "I didn't mean it, your goddess," the witch cried out. "I didn't mean to argue. I was just walking to myself." "You dare to argue with me?" screamed the Grand High Witch. "I was just talking to myself," cried the wretched witch. "I swear it, your greatness." She began to shake with fear. The Grand High Witch took a quick step forward, and then she spoke again. It was in a voice that made my blood run cold. "A stupid witch who answers back must burn until her bones are black," she screamed. "No, no," begged the witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch went on. "A foolish witch without a brain must sizzle in the fairy flame." "Save me," cried the wretched witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch took no notice of her. She spoke again. "An idiotic witch like you must roast upon the barbecue." "Forgive me, oh, your greatness," cried the miserable culprit. "I didn't mean it." But the Grand High Witch continued with her terrible recital. A witch who dares to say I'm wrong will not be with us very long. At a moment later, a stream of sparks that looked like tiny white hot metal flings came shooting out of the Grand High Witch's eyes and flew straight towards that one who had dared to speak. I saw the sparks strings against her head burrowing into her head and screamed a horrible howling scream, and put off smoke rose another her. A smell of burning meat filled the room. Nobody moved. Like me, they were all watching the smoke, and when it had cleared away, the chair was empty. I caught a glimpse of something wispy white like a little cloud, fluttering upwards and disappearing out of the window. A great sigh rose up from the audience. The Grand High Witch glared around the room. I hope nobody else is going to make crows today, she remarked. There was a deadly silence. Frizzled like a fritter, said the Grand High Witch. Cooked like a carrot, you will never see her again. Now we can get down to business. Mouse Maker. Children are revolting, screamed the Grand High Witch. We will wipe them all away. We will scrub them off the face of the earth. We will flush them down to the drain. Yes, yes, shouted the audience. We'll wipe them away, scrub them off the earth, flush them down the drain. Children are full and filthy, thundered the Grand High Witch. They are, cursed the English witches. They are full and filthy. Children are dirty and stinky, screamed the Grand High Witch. Dirty and stinky, chilled, cried the audience, getting more and more worked up. Children are smelling of dogs' droppings, screeched the Grand High Witch. Pooh, the cried audience, pooh! They're worse than dogs' droppings, screeched the Grand High Witch. Dogs' droppings is smelling like violets and primroses compared with children. Violets and primroses, chanted the audience. They were clasping and cheering almost every word spoken from the platform. The speaker seemed to have them completely under her spell. To talk about children is making me sick, screamed the Grand High Witch. I'm feeling sick when I'm thinking about them. Fetch me a basin. The Grand High Witch paused and glared at the mass of eager faces in the audience. They waited, wanting more. So now, barred the Grand High Witch, so now I'm having a plan. I'm having a gigantic plan for getting rid of every single child in all of England. The witches gasped. They turned and gave each other clerish grins of excitement. Yes, thundered the Grand High Witch. We shall wish them and swallow them, and we shall make to disappear every single smelly little brat in England in one stroke. Whoopee! Cried the witches, clapping their hands. You are brilliant, oh, your gardeners. You are fantastic. Shut up and listen, snapped the Grand High Witch. Listen very carefully and let us not to be having any mix-ups. The audience leaned forward, eager to learn how this magic was going to be performed. Every one of you, the Grand High Witch said, is to go back to your hometowns immediately and resign from your jobs. Resign, get notice, retire. We will, cried. We will resign from our jobs. And after you have resigned from your jobs, the Grand High Witch went on, each and every one of you will be going out and you will be buying. She paused. What we will be buying? They cried. Tell us, oh brilliant one, what is it we shall be buying? Sweet shops, shouted the Grand High Witch. Sweet shops, they cried. We are going to buy sweet shops. At a Framshian Swiss. Each of you will be buying for herself a sweet shop. You will be buying the very best and most respectable sweet shops in England. We will, they answered. Their dreadful voices were like a chorus of dentist drills, all grinning away together. I am wanting no turbany, halfpenny, crumbly little tobacco selling in newspapers, sweet shops, shouted the Grand High Witch. I am nothing you to get only very best shops filled up high with piles and piles of luscious sweets and tasty chalks. The best, they cried. We shall buy the best sweet shops in town. You will be having no trouble in getting what you want, shouted the Grand High Witch, because you will be offering 4 times as much a shop. It's true that somebody is refusing an offer like that. Money, it is not a problem to us witches, as you know very well. I have brought with me 6 trunks stuffed full of English banknotes, all new and crisp, and all of them, she added, with a fiendish leer, all of them homemade. The witches in the audience grinned, appreciating this joke. At that point, one foolish witch got so excited at the possibility presented by owning a sweet shop that she leaped over her head and shouted, The children will come flocking to my shop, and I will feed them poisoned sweets and poisoned chalks and wipe them out like whistles. The room became suddenly silent. I saw the tiny body of the Grand High Witch sniffing and then go rigid with rage. Who spoke? She shrieked. It was you? You over there? The culprit sat down fast and covered her face with her crowed hands. You glittering pumpkin, squeezed the Giant High Witch, you brainless bunk-roomer. Are you not realizing that if you are going to round poison little children, you will be cut in 5 minutes flat? Never in my life am I heard such a bush-revolving suggestion coming from a witch. The entire audience cowered and shook. I'm quite sure they all know, as I did, that the terrible white-hot sparks were about to start flying again. Curiously enough, they didn't. If such a Tom-feeding idea is all that can you be coming up with? Thundered the Grand High Witch. Then it is no wonder England is still swarming with rotten little children. There was another silence. The Grand High Witch glared at the witches in the audience. "Do you not know," she shouted at them, "that witches are working only with magic?" "We know, your greatness," they all answered. "Of course we know." The Grand High Witch grated her bonny gloved hands against each other and cried out, "So each of you is owning a magnificent sweet shop. The next move is that all of you will be announcing in the window of your shop that on a certain day you will be having a great gala opening with 3 sweets and chocolates to every child. This will bring them it, the greedy little brutes," cried the audience. "They will be fighting to get through the doors." Next, continuing the Grand High Witch, "you will prepare yourselves for this great gala opening by filling every choke and every sweet in your shop with my very last and greatest magic formula. This is known as Formula 76 Delayed Action Mouse Marker." "Delayed Action Mouse Maker?" they shouted. "She's done it again. Her greatness had concocted yet another of her wondrous magic child killers. How do we make it? Oh, brilliant one!" "Exercise patience," answered the Grand High Witch. "First, I am explaining to you how my formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker is working. Listen carefully." "We are listening," cried the audience, who were now jumping up and down on their chairs with excitement. "Delayed Action Mouse Maker is a green liquid," explained the Grand High Witch, "and 1 dropped in each choke or stout will be quite enough. So where it what happens? Child each choke which has any Delayed Action Mouse Maker liquid. Child goes home feeling fine. Child goes bed, still feeling fine. Child wakes up in the morning still okay. Child goes to school still feeling fine. Formula, you understand, is delayed action. It is not working yet. We understand. Oh, brainy one, cried the audience. But when it does it start working? It starts working at exactly 9 o'clock, when the child is arriving at school, shouted the Grand High Witch triumphantly. The child arrives at school. Delayed Action Mouse Maker immediately starts to work. Child starts to shrink. Child is starting to grow fur. Child is starting to grow tail. All this happening is precisely 26 seconds. After 26 seconds, child is not a child any longer. It is a mouse. A mouse? Cried the witches. What a frumpious thought. Classroom will all be snoring with mice, shouted the Grand High Witch. Chaos, all pandemonium will be raging in the very school in England. Teachers will be hopping up and down. Women teachers will be standing on desks and holding up skirts and yelling, "Help, help, help!" they will, cried the audience. And what? Shouted the Grand High Witch. It has happened next in every school. Tell us, they cried, tell us, oh briny one. The Grand High Witch stretched her strangling neck forward and grinned at the audience, showing 2 rows of pointed teeth slightly blue. She raised her voice louder than ever and shouted, "Mousetraps is coming out." "Mousetraps," cried the witches. "And cheese," shouted the Grand High Witch teachers, is all rushing and running out of and getting mousetraps and baiting them with cheese and putting them down all over school. Mrs. Nibble and Cheese, mousetraps is going off all over school. Mousetraps is going snap to snap, and Mousehead is rolling across the flocks like marbles. All over England, with the very school in England, noise snapping mousetraps will be heard. At this point, the disgusting old Grand High Witch began to do a sort of witch dance, up and down the platform, stamping her feet and clapping her hands. The entire audience joined in the clapping and the foot stamping. They were making such a tremendous racket that I thought surely Mr. Stranger would be heard if come banging at the door, but he didn't. Then, above all this noise, I heard the voice of the Grand High Witch screaming out of some sort of an awful gloating song. "Down with children, do them it, boil their bones and fry their skin. Pinch them, squish them, pash them, mash them, break them, shake them, slash them, smash them, offer jokes with magic powder, say it up and say it louder, scram them full of sticky eats, and them home still cuddling sweets, and in the morning little fools go marching off to separate schools. A girl feels sick and goes all pale. She yells, 'Hey look, I'm grown a tail.' A boy who's standing next to her screams, 'Help, I think I'm growing fur.' Another shouts, 'We look like freaks. The whiskers growing on our cheeks.' A boy who's extremely tall cries out, 'What's wrong? I'm growing small.' For tiny legs begin to sprout from everybody roams about, and all the wins and all the tries. There are no children, only mice. In every school is mice galore, all returning round the schoolroom floor, and all the poor demented teachers is yelling, 'Hey, who are these creatures?' They stand upon the desk and shout, 'Get out, you filthy mice, get out!' Will someone fetch some mousetraps, please? You don't forget to bring the cheese. Now mousetraps come in very trap. Go snipply snip and snapply snap. The mousetraps have a powerful spring. The springs go crack and snap and ping. It's lovely noise for us to hear. It's music to a witch's ear. That mist is every palace around, beautiful feet deep upon the ground, with teachers searching left and right, but one single child in sight. The teachers cry, 'What's going on? On where have all the children's gone? In 9:30, it's all a rule, they're never late, and this for school. Poor teachers don't know what to do. Some sit and read, and just a few amuse themselves throughout the day by sweeping all the mice away, and all of us witches shout hooray. The recipe. I hope you haven't forgotten that while all this was going on, I was still stuck behind the screen on my hands and knees with one eye glued to the crack. I don't know how long I had been there, but it seemed like forever. The worst part of this was not being allowed to cut or to make a sound, and knowing that if I did, I was as good as dead. And all the way through, I was living in constant terror that one of the witches in the back row was going to get a whiff of my presence through those special nose holes of hers. My only hope, as I saw it, was the fact that I hadn't washed for days. That and the never-ending excitement and clapping and shouting that was going in the room. The witches were thinking of nothing except the Grand High Witch up there on the platform and her great plan for wiping out all the children of England. They certainly weren't sniffing around for a child in the room. In their wildest dreams, if witches have dreams, she would have occurred to any of them. I kept still and prayed. The Grand High Witch's dreadful, gloating song was over on, and the audience was clapping madly and shouting, "Brilliant! Sensational! Marvelous! You're a genius, oh brainy one!" It's a thrilling invention, this delayed action mouse maker. It is a winner, and the beauty of it is that the teacher will be ones who pop off the stinking little children. It won't be as us going it. We shall never be caught. Witches are never caught, snapped the Grand High Witch. Attention now. I want everybody attention, for I am about to be telling you what you must to prepare Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker. Suddenly, there came great gasp from the audience. This was followed by a hubbub of shrieking and yelling, and I saw many of the witches leaping to their feet and pointing at the platform and crying out, "Miss, miss, miss!" She's done it to show us. The brainy one has turned 2 children into mice, and they are. I looked over the platform. The mice were all right, 2 of them running around near the Grand High Witch's skirts. But these were not field mice, of house mice, of food mice or harvest mice. They were white mice. I recognized them immediately as being my own little William and Mary. "Miss," shouted the audience, "our leader has made mice to appear out of nowhere. Get the mouse trap. Fetch the cheese." I saw the Grand High Witch peering down at the floor and staring with obvious puzzlement at William and Mary. She bent lower to get a closer look. Then she straightened and shouted, "Quiet!" The audience became silent and sat down.